do bad is we've talked about our next couple many times under many guises, partly through what they've done, but also partly through our friendship with them. So you know them already from Like the Wind, and inspired by that, they've recently brought out a book which not only was Dean Karnassis, but also Holly Rush were basically hosting the launch, which was pretty cool. I went along to last week. So welcome to the podcast, the lovely Julie and Simon Freeman.
Hi, David.
Thank you.
How you doing, guys?
Great.
Yeah, pretty good. We're very excited. The book has just come out, and there's still a bit of pinch me moments where we think, wow, there's an actual book. We can actually hold it. So it's really it's not something we know from the magazine, but the book is pretty different. It's something I'm very happy about.
Well, how does a book launch work when actually your customers really are probably linked to the magazine, who are all in mountainous places around the world?
Yeah. It's really, so the whole process of publishing the book came about because the publisher, Thames and Hudson, approached us and said, we love what you're doing with the magazine, and we'd like to collaborate with you guys on the production of a book. So I think interestingly for us, the Like the Wind readers, the people that are buying the magazine, are obviously a really, really important audience that we're hoping will want to buy the book. But actually Thames and Hudson, as a global publisher, reaches a whole new audience of people that might not be familiar with Like the Wind at all, and will buy Running Wild, the name of the book, because it's in bookshops. It's as my mum keeps saying, so you're going to be like in real proper bookshops? Like, yes, we're going to be in real actual bookshops. So I think that the book's going to reach a whole load of people who are not, potentially not even familiar with Like the Wind at all, which is great. It's super exciting for us.
And is it because you guys started up Like the Wind, and while it's a lot of contributor content, you've also done a lot of the heavy lifting with the editing, but also the writing, particularly towards the beginning. How's that compared to writing a book where it's all one narrative?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because actually when we were first approached, and we're talking like 3 years ago, the original idea was that we would travel to locations around the world and find these great trails and write about the local area and what's special about these places and why they're unique, and how and why people should go trail running in the locations that we selected. And then of course the pandemic hit, and that meant it was impossible for us to travel. So we came up with a slightly different scheme with the publisher, which is that there's 16 chapters, which is 16 different locations around the world. And actually, Julie and I have only written 2 of them. And the other 14 are people that we knew in the trail running world that we contacted and said, can we commission you to write a chapter about an area that you're super familiar with? So, and a lot of it was people writing about their sort of home areas. So, Rob Craw wrote about Flagstaff, Lizzie Hawker wrote about Nepal, Anna Gatta wrote about Kungsleden in Sweden. So we basically tapped into our kind of global network of trail runners and writers. So our job, apart from the 2 chapters that we wrote, was actually turned into much more like a curation job of, working with those guides to make sure that we got the same sort of information and the same sort of feel for each chapter. So actually there wasn't a huge amount of writing on our part. It was more, guiding and curating and editing. And I think actually the book is a lot better as a result, because we're really getting, I mentioned Rob Craw. Rob Craw is like he lives and breathes Flagstaff. So when he talks about it, when he's sort of describing the area, it's an area that he knows like the back of his hand. Whereas I think if Julie and I'd gone to Flagstaff, we would have had a good stab at writing a chapter, but we wouldn't have quite got the same level of dirt under the fingernails that Rob Craw has, as one example. And we've replicated that 14 times.
I guess there's also a huge difference between running some trails in May to in June to in November. And that's the key, where actually, trail runners in each region are running at different times, different distances, different experiences. And so how did you... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jim.
No, I just want to say it was super important for us to, and for the publisher as well, they approached us because they knew Like the Wind, and our publisher is a runner himself, so he was like, I respect the fact that Like the Wind is about how to run. It's not about how to run, it's about why we run.
It's the exact opposite.
It's about why we run, and that's something that we wanted to actually run through the magazine, and it's all about the impressions and the feelings and the culture and connecting to the land and all of that. And it's very, as you say, it's very difficult to get a feel for that if you're only passing and you're only coming for a weekend. In the same vein, the Like the Wind is very visual, like some of your audience might know.
Yeah.
And we've been collaborating with brilliant sports photographers who a lot of them are runners as well, for over 7 years, and was super important, and we're very grateful that we've had this network. So the book was really enhanced by having 14 different photographers, actually more, because some chapters we had 2 photographers, which is not something that we would have pulled off just being Simon and I. So I'm actually thankful. That's one of the few positive aspects to the pandemic, is that it made the book probably better.
Yeah, I guess that's something you wouldn't have known. Well, and also the difference is that even if you'd have thought that was a good idea previously, as people, we often don't want to ask too much of friends and networks, and it feels like too much of a burden, even if it's a joy for them to do. But did you choose the location first, or the runner/writer first? Because I know from experience that a good runner does not necessarily make a good writer, and vice versa. But how did you select those locations and those individuals?
So we did talk to the publisher right from the beginning, and we mapped out some rough areas. And we're talking about how many chapters are we going to have in Western Europe, how many chapters in the US, where else do we definitely want to cover. So it was very it was fairly open, but we knew that we wanted X number of chapters in certain parts of the world. And then your point is valid about great runners not necessarily being great writers, but that's something we've been dealing with since day one of Like the Wind magazine. I.e., some of the most amazing stories come from people who, by their own admission, will say, I'm not into writing, I'm not a great writer or whatever. And our job has always been, well, how do we get that story anyway? Yeah. So some of the chapters, the runner, who happened to be a really good writer, just said, I'll take it on, I'll send you back, the text. And then our job was editing. In some cases, it was me or Julie on a 3-hour Zoom call with somebody as they literally described the trails in the location that they're in and a route that they were sort of thinking would be appropriate for the book, and they just described it to us, and we kind of wrote copious notes, and then we created the chapter from that. So it was more kind of extracting the information rather than necessarily being put off by the fact that someone wasn't up for writing how many words per chapter, 4,000 words per chapter or whatever it was. We could kind of get around that. So we had I had a fantastic experience with a couple of people where we just had a very long conversation, and I felt like I was in that place. They were describing somewhere that is enormously close to their hearts, that to your point, David, they've run it spring, summer, autumn and winter, done thousands of miles on those trails, and they're describing somewhere that's sort of home to them. And I really felt like, I get this place. I really understand it now. So then it's just, the job is then to translate that into writing, which is relatively simple.
And what's the purpose of it? Is it because there are a lot of books out there? For example, if I've gone climbing, you'll have some books where the purpose of the book is to actually describe to you the best local routes so that you can go out there, follow the routes, understand them, know the difficulty, prepare for it properly. But then you also have other books that actually are there to try and contextualize trail running to people who aren't trail runners and try and inspire and make it more approachable for people who wouldn't necessarily be already hunting it out. So where between those two does this lie?
That's interesting. It's a discussion we had many times with the publisher and also among ourselves, because we feel like, in terms of the magazine, for example, we have people from literally any angle from running. We've got very committed road runners who are chasing the sub 2:30 marathon to mums who run trails once a week, and it covers really everything. And for this book, I think our aim was really to make sure that there was inspiration and motivation and stories that would make you really want to think, maybe I could do that as well. Maybe I could go to this one location. And a really important part is the visuals, because we wanted the photography to really transport people to those places and pick, want them to be able to picture themselves in that, not necessarily I want to run a race there, or it's just about, can I go on foot with a small backpack and I might run it, or I might fast pack it, or I might just go there to enjoy something as a 3-day hike, fast hike. Or someone else might say, I want to do that and I want to run it from sunrise to sunset in one go. And the locations we've picked, they're, I think, really representative of the variety that you can find in trail running. Simon and I, for example, are very different trail runners. I always run for enjoyment. My goal in every race is to finish with a smile, which means that, yes, I will stop at the 8 stations for way too long, and Simon would just run past and grab a bottle and keep running. And that's we're all very, very different, and I get immense enjoyment now in just enjoying the trails maybe a bit slower, and stopping at a mountain hut and having a proper meal rather than just grabbing a gel. And I think that's this kind of demonstrating that you don't have to be a committed trail runner, and there's a way to get started on more gentle terrain that doesn't have bears, that is not at 4,000 meters altitude. We have some of those as well, but it doesn't mean to be threatening. We want it to be inviting, and it's the idea that it might bring some runners to trail running. We'll see.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's the right time for it, because with lockdown and even before lockdown, it does seem that the growth in the sport isn't from younger people doing road marathons, doing 10Ks in the same way. It's all about community bases and experience, and certainly trail is that. So then, what are the areas? And I could probably guess. I'd say if I had to write 16 down, I'd come up with 10 to 12 that I think have to be in there. But can you give us a list?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's out. You can see it on our website. But there is Italy with the Dolomites, which is really we couldn't do it. Like, you have to mention the Dolomites.
Yeah.
There's Norway with the Lofoten Islands. The Chamonix Valley, which is actually where the idea of the magazine was born. So we had to, and actually that's one of the few chapters that we wrote ourselves, because we know that valley very, very, very well.
No, we've got Knoydart in Scotland.
Nice.
Yeah, Corsica, which has got this amazing trail, GR20 in Corsica. We've got the Pyrenees, which is a really lovely chapter where the guide, Tobias Muse, basically runs from France into Spain and back again, which is really nice.
Which part of the Pyrenees, out of interest?
So he's
the Monte Perdido, which is the lost mountain, which has got a bit of a mystique around it, and it's got Europe's largest canyon. So the photography is really the problem is we haven't been able to visit all the locations, and now we're super,
Yeah, we need to go
panic.
around and
Yeah, exactly.
tick the chapters off. Kungsleden I mentioned in Sweden,
Yeah.
which is this amazing trail, which is like a lot of it is on wooden planks above the marsh, and they go up into
Wow.
into the Arctic Circle, absolutely bonkers. The Lake District, obviously,
Yeah.
can't not have the Lake District.
The next one is Switzerland. There's the big Alps in Switzerland. Obviously, everyone knows the Alps, but then there's a smaller mountain called the Jura, which is where we happen to live at the moment, and it's absolutely phenomenal for trail running, and it's a perfect introduction to the trails because it's soft. It's still at in altitude, but you don't have the very high altitude, and it's peppered with small huts, so you can always find accommodation, and you can do it multi-stages. So that's one of my favorites. We've got Canada, British Columbia. That's the one with the bears.
Yeah.
And we've got the White Mountains in the US.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned Flagstaff.
Yeah.
So it's Sedona and Flagstaff.
Heading there this year.
You're going to be there this year.
Yeah. I'm out with the Golden Trail. We're
Amazing.
which race it is. Yeah, but excited for that.
Perfect. Then there's Sierra Norte de Oaxaca in Mexico, a chapter in Patagonia in Chile.
And then we rounded off with a chapter in Nepal, as Simon mentioned, with Lizzie Hawker, and one trail in the outback in Australia. And it's just, it's so fantastic to have such variety. You get all sorts of terrains. You've got all sorts of technical difficulty, but also just like cultural exposure to it's something that was really important. Walk slowly or run slowly, enjoy the culture, stay with the locals, eat with the locals, which is something that you don't necessarily get when you go to do a race abroad, where it's sometimes a bit rushed and you go for a race, you spend 3 days there and then you fly back. This is really about more of an exploration, taking the time. And I think to your previous question, we do mention some specific trails, so there is indication of this is an amazing trail to do for those reasons, but we don't have very detailed map. It's not a guide that has got very detailed maps. It's more about encouraging people to maybe research that location, because what they have read about the culture, about the scenery, about the landscape and the photography has made them think, wow, I really want to go there one day, bucket list destination.
I had this great experience. I had my two best friends from uni came out. We went skiing in France together, and we had an early copy of the book, like a kind of pre-launch copy of the book, which I'd taken to kind of show my two mates while we were on holiday together skiing. And we was in the apartment having a drink or whatever, and all of a sudden one of the two of them held up the book and said to the two of us, "Oh, guys, I've just read the chapter on, I can't remember, I think it was the Dolomites." And he was like, "We've got to go there. We've got to go and do this 3-day trail run in the Dolomites."
And they're not trail runners.
No, they're both road marathon runners and half marathon runners. And I just thought, if we can do that, a few times, that's an amazing sort of outcome for the book. He was literally like, let's pick a weekend, a long weekend, and the three of us will fly out and go and run that trail as described, in the Dolomites.
And it sounds almost as if each chapter is a love letter to the area. From what you've heard back from the 14 others, are there any kind of themes or any particular reasons that you think makes a trail deeply personal and that level above other areas for the individuals?
Oh, that's a great question.
Wow.
That's a really great question. I mean, I think I've already said this. A number of the people, so we had Ricky Lightfoot talking about the Lake District. We had Rob Craw talking about Flagstaff. We had David Grazielli talking about the Dolomites. Tobias now lives in the Pyrenees. In the Pyrenees.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of them, but not all, they're the trails that they've just become really, or areas that they've become really familiar with, and they're really excited to sort of almost welcome guests into these locations. So they're all very different from one another. Excuse me, losing my voice.
Yeah, I think it's a mix of the familiarity. It's, you know, what you know and learn to love, or and on the other hand, what you can discover. Like, you know, in the case of Nepal and Lizzie Hawker, she wasn't born in Nepal. She discovered it and fell in love with it, and she's now, you know, she's run probably every trail around Kathmandu, and she's done these, you know, incredible feats of endurance, traversing the pretty much all of the Himalayas. But that's something that was acquired. And in the case of Corsica, for example, we spoke to Guillaume Peretti, who, you know, for a long time had the record, broke Kilian's record. He was getting ready for it. He was born in Corsica and always had this dream of maybe one day, you know, running in the mountains. And then he did it. And then he was preparing to do this GR20 traverse on his own mountains, the mountains he knew. And then Kilian comes up and basically breaks the record by, I don't know, 3 days. And then and Guillaume was like, and I couldn't believe it, this guy had broken my dream. And I thought, I'm still going to do it. And he did. He broke it. And he said, you know, I made sure I knew every single stone, and I went back and back and back with my mates, and I just wanted to do it. And it's still, you know, it's still his favorite location to run. So in his case, it's the familiarity, and we've seen everything. We've got Hilary Matheson, who is a great photographer and a graphic designer and a writer as well. And she talks about her native British Columbia, and she says, although I've seen most of the world, whenever I get back to my British Columbia, there's so much to explore, because it's obviously like, I can't remember how many times the size of Britain.
Oh, what did Holly say when we?
Times?
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. The amount of times that the UK would fit into British Columbia.
You almost see Oh, sorry, go ahead, Simon.
No, I was going to say, I think it's probably that. And I think that's also something that a lot of people can relate to. Like, if you've got somebody come to stay with you, David, I'm sure if they said to you, where do we go for a run? You'd be like, I know just the place. I love this place. And you take them somewhere that's very familiar to you, new to them, but you would be talking so enthusiastically about the things they're going to see and, you know, the experience they're going to have in this area. So I think that's probably something that knits a lot of the chapters together.
Because you almost see the companion piece where they all switch and they all then give their own views of having spent a month, for example, with Ricky in the Lake District, or with Lizzie in Nepal, because I'm sure it sounds like a lot of it is prized in their area, and there's nothing worse than when your friend gets a better car than you, and you're like, crap, I thought my car was good, or whatever it may be, you know, whatever your achievements are that you've prided yourself, and you're like, we've got the best types of fails, and like, oh wow, Sweden's got poor. And so that would be quite an interesting angle as well, just to get the, I guess, a different perspective on everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so were there some areas that you couldn't go to, or some where you just didn't know how quite to approach it, that you think these are areas of the world where the trail deserves to be in this book, but we just haven't managed to do it this time?
Oh, David, that's a heartbreaking question. We had a list of about 40 locations to start with. And, you know, when you start going into the detail and you realize, damn, we have to cap it at some point, and we have to start somewhere, and we decided on the 16. But the list of, you know, the next episodes, if you like, you know, we hope that the book does well, and then
the publishers listening.
Because
exactly.
Oh my God,
Lucas, if you're listening, Running Wild 2, we've got loads of places.
There's no question about that.
I mean, it's probably and you know, the list is absolutely endless. You know, we don't. There's no. We were obviously limited to 16. So there's nowhere in India.
Yeah.
There's nowhere in Turkey.
China.
There's nowhere in China.
Hong Kong.
South America, we didn't really get, you know, this South America's so vast.
Yeah.
We've got 2 chapters.
I think,
So
it was a mix this time of some well-known locations that we just couldn't leave out. Like you have to cover Chamonix. Nepal was almost, something that we really wanted to do. But there's also some lesser known destinations like Switzerland I mentioned earlier. And
Noida
is probably not something that jumps. So we try to not just go through the top 10 or the top 16 destinations, because that's completely subjective. And there's a place for the kind of the top, the bucket list destinations. We also wanted to open someone's eyes to something that, like we went to Slovenia a few years ago, and we were desperate to do that as well. But in this occasion, we couldn't make it happen. And that's definitely one for volume 2. It's an incredible destination. It's kind of the end of the Alps, and it's lush forests, and it's incredible trail running there. Or Tuscany in Italy. You don't necessarily think about it because everyone thinks about the Dolomites, but we've got drafts of a lot of those destinations.
As you mentioned, we had Dean Karnazes, who wrote the foreword to the book, was a guest on the sort of launch event, the virtual launch event that we did, and he rightly pointed out, he's a what did he say? He said, I'm 100% Greek. And he said, if I was to write a chapter, I'd want to write it on trail running in Greece. Probably not. So it's like, well, then we have to do a second book because Dean's insisting on a chapter in Greece. So
I mean, from what I understand about Dean's experience of Greece, it's just eating dates for 150 miles and shitting himself while he pukes to the end of a Spartathlon, which would be a good chapter in itself.
We might have to tone him down a little bit in order to make it a chapter that's palatable to more than 5 people.
Can I just say as well, because I'm not sure we've actually given your audience the right idea about the book. We don't really have. It's not a guidebook, and it doesn't really have how to eat, how to dress. I mean, there is a bit of advice for people who have never done it, and we want it to be really approachable. But it's mostly about the stories and the kind of the emotions and the experience, rather than how to trail run. But I just wanted to come back on Dean Karnazes. He wrote I think a really wonderful foreword to the book. He had the book a bit earlier, so that he could write something. And I just want to read 2 sentences he wrote, which I think comes back to why we pick those trails and the fact that they're quite disparate, the big ones, the small ones, the local ones, and the one that's in Patagonia. And he says, each trail is a unique experience, one that leaves an indelible impression on its followers. We recall what it feels like because it affects us so intimately. The trail stays with us, inside us, like a warm glow. And obviously there's many more words, but I thought that's really about it. It's how does it make people feel? It's not necessarily about, is it Instagrammable? But, is it going to move you, and is it going to make you talk about it later?
Yeah, I think that's true, actually. And if I think of my previous runs the ones I've loved haven't always necessarily been the ones that I'd expect to from the start. It's often when you're at a friend's wedding and you go for a run, squeeze one in, or you're forced into an area where you've not planned some route, but you're just out the door and up the road, and you suddenly something happens that you don't expect, and it's that magic, I guess, between the mixture of environment and circumstances and feeling emotion. And if for anyone who were there any that really surprised you? Any regions that you'd almost written off until someone sold you on their view of it, and you actually understood that actually it offered a lot more than you might expect?
I mean, when the Kungsleden was first described to me, I must admit, I thought, that sounds a bit mad. Like, not what I would want to do. It's basically running up the middle of an absolutely enormous valley for 150 kilometers towards the Arctic Circle, and most of it is on kind of wooden sort of gangplanks. And I thought, that doesn't sound very nice at all.
Yeah, almost not trail.
Yeah, exactly. But then, we started talking to the guide, to Anna Gatta, and she just absolutely brought it to life. She just described how you can start by climbing a local mountain. You just go into the mountain hut and rent crampons and just do a quick up and down the local mountain. And then, the food and how the local indigenous people farm reindeer in this great vast plain. I mean, it's this enormous kind of glacial plain, and the chapters come out absolutely beautifully. It wasn't one that I was expecting to be so kind of poetic. And yeah, having received the chapter, read it and worked a bit with it, I thought, actually, I'd love to go and do that. And that's probably the litmus test for most of this, is that there isn't a single chapter that I think, not that fussed. Every single one of them, I'm desperate to go and run it.
And do you think, because coincidentally, my brother-in-law's downstairs, who lived in Chamonix for about 8 years, and throughout that time, he said it's transformed massively. And I'm sure your experience will be very similar, where even 10, 15 years ago, relatively, Chamonix wasn't really known for running. UTMB wasn't known outside of hardcore trail runners. Do you feel that there's almost a limit on how many trails individuals? Well, it feels in some ways some trails are being overly popularized to the degradation of everything, really, where there's so many trails, but actually because so many people are so focused on UTMB or Chamonix or that, the trails themselves are no longer what they were. And the Bob Graham round, we've spoken to many people where it's almost you can do it following the trail rather than having to know the route because it's so well trodden. And do you have you sensed that from many of these locations, and is that part of the reason to try and popularize more trails, to try and spread the love?
Yeah, it's a really great point, David. It can't be a bad thing, I think, if it attracts people to the sport, because it's done on trails that are so well signposted, you can't really get lost. You still have a bit of a sense of adventure, because if you get stuck in a storm at 2,000 meters, you will feel a bit threatened. But you can't really. I mean, it's difficult to get lost, and yet you get this massive, adrenaline rush when you get to the top. After 2 or 3 false stops, you get to the top of the mountain, and you see on the other side. And I think we do need those very popular trails as an entry, as a footstep onto maybe something bigger. And Chamonix is not just a UTMB course, which obviously lots of people have been hiking for way
centuries.
Centuries, probably way before the trail runners came along. People were hiking that trail anyway. And I'm not against it, and I think it just gives a taste. It brought actually a chapter that we wrote about etiquette and trail etiquette, and the fact that yes, it is more populated in some areas, and it's super important that runners don't just go running down, scaring the hikers and scaring the people who are maybe less able. And we need to respect nature, obviously, and we talk about that a bit in the book. So I think there's a place for the very popular trails. I would never look down on those trails. That's where I started. Well, actually, we started trail running in Chamonix by accident, because we had to cover 80K in 2 days instead of the 4 days we had planned because of a storm. And we did it, and I was like, oh my God, I think this is actually trail running, isn't it? But we had, we were hiking in boots, and we ran 80K in hiking boots with our backpacks with sleeping bags in them. So,
wow.
Yeah, so that was an accidental start, but it was made possible because the trails are so easy to follow, and it's not really technical. It's not very technical. And then the second year we went back, we did something completely different. So you can get away from people even in the Chamonix Valley, and as it's almost giving you the taste for something, and then you can go explore by yourself once you're confident, because it's not necessarily it's a bit. Some people might feel a bit how do you say,
intimidated
by trail running. And we really wanted to remove that barrier and saying, let's just start with a fast hike and you'll see. And once you get captured by these amazing mountains and the views and the food, then you want to get back, and maybe you're prepared, you're ready for the next time to do a bit more running than walking. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we move on to Like the Wind, if you've got time, where's the best place for people to buy the book to get you guys the most money from that sale?
That's easy. They go to likethewindmagazine.com. They can buy the book through the shop, and anyone that orders the book from us gets a set of 6 postcards that they won't get if they buy it from someone else. And we get more money.
Yeah, it really helps.
Double win.
Really helps us.
Double win, yeah.
So then you mentioned when the idea of Like the Wind came to you in Chamonix, and I think some of our listeners will have heard you talk about the start before. Most of our listeners will know about it because we've spoken about it several times. But do you want to kind of quickly go over again what it was? Why it was, more than what it was, why it was that you thought it was something that was needed?
It's funny because we're just in the process of having a bit of a tidy up, emptying an office, and I'm finding lots of old magazines that I was buying that were like cycling magazines, surfing magazines, climbing magazines, skateboarding magazines, that were very much of that sort of long form storytelling, narrative type, very much about the sort of culture of the sport versus the mechanics. And I really wanted that for myself in running. I just kind of got to a point where I was more interested in the culture and the history of running than I was in the mechanics. So really it came from that. It came from the fact that we just were sort of looking longingly at these amazing surfing journals and cycling magazines, and thinking I'd quite like to read that style of magazine about running. I wonder if I'm alone in that. So we launched Like the Wind, really not the way that you should do it. Like, we hadn't done any market research, we just thought we'll curate a bunch of stories that are very much about the spirit of running, the culture of running, the why we run rather than the how. Print 1,000 copies because that's what we could afford with our meager savings, and just see if other people want it. And thankfully they did. I had this recurring nightmare that we'd sort of have a loft full of moldy magazines that it never sold, but issue 1 sold out, and that was basically it. I mean, it wasn't really any more sophisticated than that.
But why do you think? Because what I find interesting about that is that, for me, running certainly is, for a lot of people, about chasing times and monitoring the metrics. But for cycling is, in my head, far more like that. They're far more focused on power, the outage, everything is absolutely monitored. So why do you think it is that existed for so long in cycling, but not in running, when running's a larger sport, and actually has more of a, I think it has more stories in background, in that you do get ultra runners, you do get these long hiking, trail running hikes that you don't necessarily get quite as much in cycling.
Yeah.
I'll let Simon answer that, but I must say that for me it's still a puzzling question. I mean, I don't understand, and when we started it, we thought someone must have launched a magazine like that before and it didn't succeed, or something we don't know about, or we're too naive and we're stupid, and it's an idea that's it's never going to work. I don't actually know to this day why there wasn't Like the Wind before, something similar, because it does have a place, and we still think that there's space for many more magazines like us that talk about the beauty, the spirit of the sport, rather than the mechanics of it. And I think even if you are interested in the numbers, which if you're a competitive runner, you should, and I think we've all done it. I think it depends on where you are in your life cycle as a runner. Are you chasing the PBs, or are you
He's really semi-retired like me.
Yeah, exactly. Have you ticked your boxes, and then you're looking for maybe something a bit different. You need the adrenaline a bit more.
A bit more soulful.
Yeah, it's really, we all have, your running will probably evolve tremendously from between you start and I think that the magazine talks about the motivation behind why we still do that stupid sport that's super painful, and where you find the strength. What is your personal reason for doing it over and over and over again?
I've got a pet theory, which is based on what I just said about the perceived process of creating a magazine. So I think that there are millions and millions and millions of people who run because it's easy, it's relatively cheap, it's accessible, it doesn't take a lot of time. I mean, I was sitting in a cafe today doing a bit of work, and the lady that owns the cafe was talking about going for a run, and then two customers came in for a coffee, and they were talking about, let's meet up tomorrow morning and go for a run. I don't think any of those three women would buy a copy of Like the Wind magazine, because I think there's millions of people who run for the fact that it's great exercise, it's great for you physically and mentally, but it's just something they fit into their lives.
Yeah.
I think there's a subsect of runners who listen to podcasts like this, buy books about running, watch films about running, buy Like the Wind magazine, who are more interested in the culture and the spirit of running than they've gone beyond I just run a few times a week to try and kind of keep the pounds off. That's our target audience, and I think the same is true in cycling. I think there's people who ride a bike to work, and there are cyclists, and the cyclists are the ones that obsess over the Tour de France and the weight of their bike and Fausto Coppi and all of that kind of cultural stuff. They had a whole bunch of magazines that catered to them. I think that the runners who are let's just use the word, are obsessed about running, were just less visible. The mass of people that just run a couple of times a week are where that traditional, I guess for want of a better word, traditional running magazines were targeting. But that left quite a large minority. And that's what we're aiming at with Like the Wind. That's who I was.
And I remember when because I think I was at the book launch in, was it Brick Lane or
the magazine launch party. Yeah, we've got you, man, on camera. You were there.
And I think I remember at the time thinking, it's all very brave. Magazines are closing down. Everyone's doing more and more advertising, and even Time Out's NME are both going to free giving away as their business model, and you're doing far more expensive with no adverts, and at a time when no one appears to be wanting to pick anything up and flip pages rather than scroll screens. But do you think actually it almost came along at a time when people were yearning to treasure paper again, or do you think this would have survived 10 years before?
Well, I mean, we had a slight advantage in that we basically didn't try to make money out of the magazine. So, there wasn't a commercial pressure for a start. We were doing it for the love of it.
Yeah, we had day jobs. Like, we still have day jobs, next to the magazine. The magazine was always a side project. So we didn't need to, to take a salary, or it was literally just what are the actual expenses to make the magazine, rather than trying to make it a commercially viable enterprise from day one. And we thought we'll take advantage of that by not taking advertising and seeing how it develops.
Well, and of course, the way that you sell advertising in a traditional magazine is by inflating your circulation figures. And if you want to inflate your circulation figures, you've got to go for the middle of the bell curve, right? You've got to appeal to the biggest number of people possible so that you can say to your advertisers, we are distributing 60,000 copies, buy an ad and pay us money for it. We didn't have any ads. So I didn't care. Like, I wasn't chasing circulation figures. We were trying to create a community of people who were interested in what we were interested in. And, you know, as long as we sold enough copies that we didn't end up with boxes of moldy magazines in the loft, we were good. And that's as true today. That's still true now, 32 issues in. Our primary focus is how can we build a community of people who are interested in the same things that we are, rather than chasing circulation figures to sell ads.
And we had something really, really random happen the other day. We were talking to someone who used to be, was in, talking about a future article coming up, and this guy said, oh, actually, I remember very well the first time I heard about Like the Wind, because I was working at this well-established running magazine in the US, and the publisher came up and threw a copy of Like the Wind in the middle of the table and said something like, look at those idiots, you know, they won't last. And this guy said, and the best thing is that 5 years later, we closed down and you guys are just going stronger. And I thought that's the, you know, the turtle and the hare, or David and Goliath. So, it made me so sad for them that they didn't have the vision of, they were just pursuing this advertising, an old-fashioned advertising model, which actually in the end didn't really pan out for them.
So, and I also think this, and this is not to get, I mean, I'm fitting the narrative to something that suits me. But I also think that in lots of areas, people are, I don't know if yearning is the right word, but embracing a slightly more analog way of living. You know, they want to sit with a beer or a coffee and read a book. You know, vinyl is making a resurgence.
Cassettes, apparently, I've heard.
Cassettes.
If you're young enough to remember the cassettes.
People are buying, you know, ink on paper journals like The Wind, because just for 15 minutes a day or half an hour a week, you can just sit with something that isn't beeping and flashing notifications, and just spend just a little bit of time with the thing that you're passionate about. So I think there is a bit of a swing back to a slightly more analog way of living. So we've obviously been lucky that we've kind of been there at the right moment to kind of get some benefit from that.
And when it launched, because it was timing wise, it was almost coming at the point when blogging was starting to lose its momentum, instead transitioning over to things like Instagram and podcasts. But did you see like a flood of bloggers who suddenly were like, great, I can finally get credibility. I've finally got something that I've been yearning, I've been wanting, that I've not actually got from having a blog. Did you suddenly see a huge amount of people coming forward with that, or was it quite hard to get content for it in those early days?
So that's changed dramatically as well. I mean, initially, so issues 1, 2, 3, it was me contacting people and saying, hey, we've got this little magazine you've never heard of. Can we, you know, would you write for us? And a lot of the time we were asking people to write something for free. Then we went through a period where the magazine started becoming much more widely known, and we started getting lots and lots and lots of contributions, which I think benefited the magazine because it allowed us to then start becoming a little more choosy about what we were going to publish. So we could start to get the right balance. You know, we could start to think, okay, so what things do we want to talk about in the magazine? We really want to talk about social issues in the magazine. So we want to talk about gender inequality, racism, the environment, all those sorts of things in the magazine. And then probably, we're on issue 32, probably from there's a slight misconception. It started earlier than some people think, but probably from issue 12, we started paying, like, where we could, because obviously money's tight. There's not a lot of money in publishing, but certainly for professional writers, photographers, illustrators, we pay where we can. And, we know we're not the New York Times. We're not paying, those sorts of fees. But so it's become easier in a sense that we still get really, really high quality contributions and people who say, look, I don't want to be paid. I'm really happy just to see my words in print. I love what you're doing with the mag, and I like to sort of to be part of this movement. And at the same time, we're able to support professional writers and photographers and illustrators, and kind of push our agenda a little bit in terms of talking about issues that are important to us, to kind of focus the direction of the magazine, rather than certainly the first few issues we were running around with a begging bowl, and what people sent us was kind of what we published because we needed stories.
And is there, because I'd imagine there's an element of when you're paying someone, you can actually, free is never free, really. And when you're paying someone, you can set expectations, you can be a bit more demanding. Was there an element of when you weren't paying someone and someone had put time in and you ended up with an article that you didn't think was overly good or necessarily making a valid point? Did you feel a lot of guilt and pressure into having to potentially put something in because someone's given their time to do it, whereas if someone had paid, you'd be like, sorry mate, we don't want this, but here's the money?
I mean, the editor's role is to make sure you don't get to that point. So we've had, and I've been edited. So as a writer, I've contributed for years and years and years and years. I wrote for magazines and newspapers for nothing because I wanted my words published, and I thoroughly enjoyed being edited. And so now my role is very much kind of guiding a writer and saying to them, look, I know that you're I know that you're sort of in the process of developing this piece, and can I give you a bit of guidance? I work with a lady called Imogen Lees, who is absolutely brilliant, sort of deputy editor, and Imogen and I, between us, make sure that we're providing guidance. I mean, truth be told, and this has never happened actually in the history of the magazine in 32 issues, 32 quarterly issues. But if somebody who we weren't paying just refused to kind of take any feedback, I'm not entirely sure how I'd cope with that. But every single time when we say to people, look, we've got a suggestion for how we can change the lead, or how you could like tighten things up, or can we help to maybe, add something to this story, every single time people go, oh, thanks, that's amazing, it's brilliant, I really appreciate that, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to kind of produce a better piece.
But I think it's a bit just like the book, what Simon was saying before. We get stories that are just have a value as a story. They come from non-writers, and Imogen does that a lot. She would call someone and do an interview and then write the piece, respecting the voice of the person. So we do that as well. You don't have to be a writer to submit a story to Like the Wind. The balance is now, initially, as you said, it was a lot of people who were used to writing, blogging, which served us well because they had already honed their craft on their blogs. And after a few years, we would publish something that they had written. But a lot of people are not writers, and that's absolutely fine. The same is not true for photography. We tend to work with professional photographers for that, and professional illustrators. But for writing, I think Simon and Imogen's job is a lot of times is translating the spirit of the piece, the spirit of the article, the emotions, into something that is readable and that's actually enjoyable to read.
One of my favourite pieces that's ever been in the magazine was me totally fanboying by sending an email to, info at the Dick Beardsley Foundation and saying, you have no idea who I am. I'm fascinated by the kind of, history of American marathoning in the 1970s and 80s. Could you tell us a story kind of around why, the why we run? And Dick Beardsley like 3 days later, I got back 800 words, one block of text, basically no punctuation, written. If you read it, you could hear his accent in the writing, and it was absolutely, utterly amazing. I mean, I just love the story. It's a brilliant story. Imogen and I were able to
wrestle.
refine it slightly into something that made it much more readable, but not remove Dick Beardsley from the piece, not kind of sanitize it. And I still, to this day, I absolutely love that story. Really simple. It's not very long, but it kind of typifies for me how somebody doesn't need to be a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. If they've got a great story, we'll kind of figure it out.
And do you think that as the magazine continues, there's almost a danger, because a lot of the stories I read are about finding the beauty in finding the meaning in what we're doing. And do you worry that there's an element that almost becomes a pressure on the writer, and then suddenly everyone's looking for this additional beauty and this additional meaning in every single part of the journey, where if they'd have written something that wasn't going to be in episode 35 but in episode 5, they'd have actually almost been more honest with the situation than having the narrative of I'm now reporting on it from like the wind.
That's really interesting. Do you know what? I literally had this conversation with somebody today, a lady called Steph Bishop, who is an amazing athlete.
I love Steph Bishop. She's great.
Yeah. And I was talking to Steph because she's a storyteller. She's an amazing athlete, but she's a great storyteller as well. And she was telling me about, she's just done the Speed Project solo, and she was telling me how in the middle of the Speed Project solo, she was trying to vlog, and she said I made a total hash of it because I basically chopped the top of my head off. She said I look like some kind of mad pensioner who doesn't know how to use their phone. And I said to Steph, well, I think people are primarily interested in the story.
Yeah.
And when I talk about story, I think the story has to have some element of drama. There has to be comedy, pathos, the hero going through difficulty and emerging. Like there are narrative arcs. And so I guess I guess potentially people might think, yes, it's a bit of a struggle, or there is a pressure to write something that has drama. But I think if there isn't, then people are not likely to read it. And so, again, we'll always help somebody. And very often, you know what? We'll receive a story and there'll be a middle section. For me, I always think about the middle section. Like if you describe to me running a marathon, at some point in that description, you'll say, and I felt absolutely dreadful. And that's the second you say that, I'm like, okay, so why didn't you stop? Because that's what now I'm starting to get at something. So the marathon, the story of that race, is almost like the sugar coat. It's like the sort of the shell that holds on, that encapsulates something about your character, something about a reason that motivates you to do these things, that sort of starts to talk to the human spirit. So I would just say, anyone that feels like they've got a story to tell, we can figure out how to, but there is a bit of teasing out, whether it's drama, pathos, comedy, whatever it is, we've got to sort of tease it out a little bit. I mean, you go to the cinema to watch a film because something's going to happen in the film. It's going to make you feel something. That's the same as reading a story, I think.
And would you say that there's are there some stories that people think are unique, that everyone has, that they think is unique almost, where someone's like, oh my God, I've realized this, I've got this insight on that, I've experienced this, and you're like, yeah, we kind of have done that
So
50
wax.
times. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think we've published over 400 stories in 32 issues, and there are stories that we published in the first 5 issues that probably we wouldn't publish because they would sound, like they would start sounding samey. And you're absolutely right. There is a bit of again an evolution. As a runner, you go through all those stages and you don't realize that those stages are the same for everyone. But at that time they happened to you. You're absolutely sure, you've had this revelation. And now, after publishing 400 stories, I think we're much more aware of that. We're aware of the cliches. We're aware of, it's simple things like we don't take pieces that start with I anymore. It's not a blog. Is it just about you, or is there a wider point you're trying to make, or trying to minimize the use of cliches. But we've also started commissioning pieces because there are topics that we always thought we really want to read about that, and we never really had the means to say, okay, could you write about that? What's your opinion about that? Can you do that? And now we can. So it's evolved from, we can be the balance is a bit different because the if you like, reader submitted stories are still part of the magazine, but we're going to pick a smaller proportion. So we're a bit more picky maybe when it comes to the kind of so what of the story. And we balance that with pieces that are commissioned to maybe more experienced writers who do a real journalistic work of researching and interviewing people. And that's, I think, what we started doing in issue 12 maybe was our first feature. And that's something that we tend on, we want to keep doing that because that's where there's value. We still have the personal stories. There's incredible, richness in those stories, but we balance that with something that's maybe a bit more researched.
But you just said something really interesting there, David, because I think that it's very, 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 very rare that somebody now does something utterly unique. Eliud Kipchoge is the first man to have run a marathon in under 2 hours. He is the only person that could write a story that ends with, and I crossed the finish line in 1:59:46, right?
Yeah.
No one else has ever done it. But apart beyond that, it's actually really rare that somebody comes to us with something where the actual thing that they're doing is
the essence.
Completely unique. But I tell you what, if you and Jody went out for a run tomorrow and ran next to one another, side by side, stride for stride, on exactly the same route, and sat down with me 10 minutes afterwards, I would get 2 completely different stories out of you. You'd have done the same thing, but I'd have been saying to you, well, what were you thinking about? And you'd be telling me a totally different narrative to the narrative that Jody would be telling me. And that talks to the human spirit. You might be telling me, I was running along and I noticed some litter on the trail, and it really got me thinking about how runners need to be super careful. Whereas at the same time, same moment, Jody could be thinking about, something that's happening in his family, or a conversation that he had with somebody, or a book that he read. So I think that the sort of the what becomes not irrelevant, but less. So I don't worry about running out of stories because I think that each person's experience is unique.
And actually,
we're just a bit more. We've learned how to eke those stories out and go past the first draft and go a bit beyond what's been submitted initially, and the craft of being able to see those stories that have promises beyond the initial.
Can I give David and his listeners a bit of a sneak preview?
Oh yeah.
We got a piece coming up in issue 32, which will be out in June, with one of somebody who is considered to be one of the UK's leading folk musicians, who undertook a challenge to run a mile on day 1, 2 miles on day 2, 3 miles on day 3. I think the cumulative total is 468 miles in January.
Oh yeah,
And obviously days 28, 29, 30 were pretty tough. His why is amazing. Like, because as soon as his email was, I've done this thing, and the thing itself was a great story, but the first question, I immediately rang him up and said, yeah, but why? Why did you do that? And that becomes the whole piece, is what motivates somebody who is already successful, one of the leading lights in the UK folk scene, to take on a challenge in January that hard. That to me that's the story. Wouldn't have mattered really if he'd run a park run. Honestly, it was getting beneath the sort of skin of the what motivated him to do it.
I'm looking forward to that, actually. I know it's not, but I'd love it with Newton Faulkner. Sadly, it's not, but it would have been my ideal story, my ideal crossover. But
not him, unfortunately. David Harbottle, good man.
Oh right, interesting. Okay, yeah. I mean, I've subscribed, so I'll be reading that anyway. But and is there? And you made me think of a potential article that I thought would be amazing. Just as you're saying, the difference is the filter with which we see things, interpret things, and see the world. That would in itself be an incredible piece. Looking at children running their first long run for them around the world, and just seeing culturally what it means to them, what their limitations were, what it how they interpret that success, because that's probably quite insightful for different societies and cultures. But
I saw a little video yesterday that popped up, and it's a guy filming out of his car window, and there's a young guy. I mean, I imagine he's probably, I don't know, 15, 16 years old, something like that, running along the side of the road. It's somewhere in India, and the guy driving that's filming is saying to this young runner who's got like a school backpack on, "Can I give you a lift?" And the guy's like, "No, I don't need a lift." He says, "What do you mean you don't need a lift? What are you doing?" They're having this conversation, and the guy is saying, "Well, where are you coming from?" He says, "Oh, I work in McDonald's. I finish at 11 o'clock and I'm running home." And he says, "Well, do you have to run home?" He said, "Yeah, I have to get home because I need to cook my brother. I need to make food for me and my brother." And he's sort of telling this whole story. And then right at the end of the video, the guy says, "But I still don't understand. Why are you running?" And he says, "Because one day I'm going to be in the army." And I was like, that's amazing. Like, that gives you so much insight into this young man's mindset, that he's going to work a full shift in McDonald's, finish at 11 o'clock, and could get home on the bus, but he's deciding to run because he's got this vision for his life. That's really the sort of stories that I love.
Well, I think that's I had another question, but actually that's a nicer point to end on the question I had. So people can subscribe just on likethewin.com. I was going to ask, actually, as a question from earlier, if you were to, what would your advice be to people about how to write a story that the world wants to read?
Don't start with I. don't title it "Why I Run." No, I mean, joke aside,
unless you're from Newcastle.
Yeah.
I think it's, sometimes Simon, I look at him and he's like, "Oh my God," and he's just received this email, and he's got tears streaming down his face.
Regular.
And that's basically that's the thing, is, can you get an emotion out of the 2-3 people who make the decisions in what goes in the magazine? And it could be really badly written. We get that every day, super badly written stories that get a smile or a laugh. I love a good belly laugh. We've got an amazing story about peanut butter. I can't wait for people to see it. And you're like, this is brilliant. It's an angle that probably we've all faced that situation. But the person is telling it in such a, it's just a fun piece, and we found a brilliant illustrator to illustrate it as well, and it's so relatable, and yet, yeah, and it's fantastic. So I think, yeah, managed to get some emotions out of us, and you,
second
and it's
that.
a winner.
Second that. Go when you sit down to write, think, what am I trying to make people feel?
Yeah.
Am I trying to make them laugh? Am I trying to make them cry? Am I trying to make them think? And then you create the story around how you're trying to, what reaction you're trying to evoke from your reader, so that they never get to the end and say, so what?
Yeah.
Because you know, like there's no, they get to the end and go, amazing. I laughed, I cried, I thought about something, I'm angry. It doesn't matter, but it's that I would say.
I'm hoping people are furious, crying and laughing all the way through this episode as well. Well, thanks so much for coming on, guys. So, is there anything else we can mention to the listener now that can benefit you? Anything else they can get involved with, or any ways in which they can support and follow?
No, I mean, for us, like, it's all about storytelling. I mean, we have a newsletter that goes out fortnightly, so people don't need to subscribe to the magazine. They could go on to likethewindmagazine.com and sign up to the newsletter, which is, again, it's just a collection of stories we send out every couple of weeks for free.
I think in terms of the magazine, we've got previous editions that we sell at £1 or £3. So if you're curious about it, but you don't want to jump in and subscribe, you can also buy a back issue and just get a feel for, the style of stories and the style of the visuals. It's a bit different, I think. So that's a good way to get into it. And it's actually likethewindmagazine.com and at likethewindmag on all the socials.
Yeah. And tell everyone about the Bad Boy Running podcast.
Indeed. Well, thanks for coming on, guys. And I'm sure I'll see you when I'm out in the summer in Chamonix.
Thank you for having us, David.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.